Canada just made a move that redraws the map of North American power. While Donald Trump spends another week battling corporate backlash over tariffs and economic uncertainty, Mark Carney has quietly delivered one of the most consequential breakthroughs in decades, a pathway for Canada to ship its energy directly to Asia without relying on the United States. A new Pacific pipeline, a united business sector, and a national strategy that blends AI with energy. This is Canada stepping out of America's shadow, and Washington knows it.
Pen finally to paper. A long-rumored memorandum of understanding was officially signed Thursday. Most notably, it'll open the door to a new crude pipeline from northern Alberta to the Pacific.
Today is a great day for the people of Alberta and for all of Canada.
The idea is to eventually move at least 1 million additional barrels of oil a day.
The announcement came in Calgary, where Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed a memorandum of understanding that lays the foundations for a new pipeline from northern Alberta to the British Columbia coast. For the first time in a generation, Canada is preparing to build an export corridor aimed not at the U.S. market, but at Japan, South Korea, India, and the rapidly growing economies across Asia. Reporting from Reuters confirmed that the project could eventually move up to 1 million barrels of oil per day, instantly transforming Canada's position in global energy markets. The political atmosphere around the signing was just as remarkable. Carney walked into a luncheon of more than 1,000 business leaders and received a standing ovation. Even AP News noted how unusual that moment was for a Liberal Prime Minister in the heart of Canada's oil country. The agreement doesn't just open a path to the Pacific, it reshapes federal and provincial responsibilities. Ottawa agreed to freeze its emissions cap for the oil and gas sector, adjust the tanker ban on BC's northern coast, and suspend clean electricity rules that Alberta said were blocking investment. Alberta, in return, signed on to expand industrial carbon pricing and fund a major carbon capture system known as Pathways Alliance. And in a surprise move that signals where Canada is heading, Alberta committed to building thousands of megawatts of AI computing capacity, aligning perfectly with Carney's ambition to make Canada an AI superpower powered by clean energy. This is not one deal, it is a blueprint for a new economic model.
Canada's pivot toward Asia is more than a strategic adjustment. It represents the end of a long-standing vulnerability. For decades, America acted as the bottleneck through which Canadian crude was forced to flow. Pipelines ran south, refineries were built south. Pricing power and political leverage sat firmly in U.S. hands. Trump leaned heavily on this imbalance. His tariff threats worked because Ottawa had nowhere else to send its oil. The lack of alternatives boxed Canada into a one-market reality. A Pacific corridor changes that reality entirely. By opening the door to a diverse set of Asian buyers, Canada can negotiate from strength rather than fear. The dynamic between Ottawa and Washington becomes more balanced. Instead of being a junior partner in continental energy politics, Canada positions itself as a global supplier capable of serving multiple regions. Trump's ability to use energy as a political weapon is weakened the moment Canada gains another outlet.
This is where the psychological shift emerges, and it is one of the most important elements of this pivot. For decades, Canadian policymakers operated under the assumption that geography locked the country into a one-way relationship with the United States. That assumption shaped trade, diplomacy, and even national identity. By targeting Japan, South Korea, India, and emerging Southeast Asian markets, Canada steps into a global arena it long hesitated to claim. This isn't just diversification, it is a statement of maturity. It signals that Canada is ready to compete on equal footing for global demand. This new confidence will shape investment decisions, inspire long-term partnerships, and create opportunities that were unimaginable when the U.S. controlled every negotiation point. With Asia in play, Canada's leverage increases, the U.S. loses strategic grip, and the continent's power balance shifts in ways Washington can no longer fully control.
But this realignment isn't happening only in energy. Carney's insistence on weaving AI infrastructure into the agreement reveals a broader strategy. AI requires enormous amounts of power. Alberta's resource base, combined with Canada's clean grid and supportive federal incentives, gives Canada a unique position. While Trump's America faces grid challenges, rising hardware costs from renewed tariffs, and tech sector frustration over immigration limits, Canada is constructing a model where energy supports AI supports industrial growth, and industrial growth supports export diversification. This integrated model is not just an economic plan, it is a competitive advantage. By pairing abundant energy with predictable policy, Canada offers the stability that global tech investors crave. In contrast, the U.S. is stuck in short-term political cycles that constantly disrupt long-range planning. This gap will only widen as AI demands accelerate worldwide. It is a cycle the U.S. cannot replicate easily because its internal politics have become too fractured to sustain long-term planning.
Carney's reception in Calgary underscores this contrast. In Canada, business leaders are rallying behind a government that offers clarity and direction. In the U.S., major sectors are increasingly alarmed. Manufacturers warn that Trump's tariff strategy is raising costs and undermining competitiveness. Tech firms object to restrictions that make talent harder to recruit. Farmers are suffering as China, India, and others shift purchases to Brazil and Argentina in response to U.S. policy unpredictability. Even traditionally conservative business coalitions are openly expressing frustration with Washington. The domestic atmospheres in the two countries are diverging: stability in Canada, turbulence in the United States. For global investors, that contrast matters.
It matters even more for geopolitics. America's historical leverage over Canada depended heavily on being the dominant buyer of Canadian crude. If Asian refiners begin securing long-term contracts, and early signals indicate they will, then U.S. refiners lose their privileged position. Canada becomes a supplier with options, not a captive exporter. And once that happens, Washington's traditional pressure points begin to disappear. This shift does not isolate Canada from the United States. It liberates Canada from being defined by it. Instead of reacting to American decisions, Canada is shaping its own economic future and building partnerships that align with a global, not continental vision.
Canada has entered a new phase, one defined by confidence, diversification, and strategic independence. By opening direct access to Asia, resetting federal regulations, and tying AI development to industrial growth, Carney is building an economy that can thrive no matter who governs in Washington. Trump, meanwhile, is learning the limits of America's influence in a world that no longer revolves around a single superpower. As Canada moves toward Asia, strengthens its business alliances, and embraces a unified national energy AI strategy, the old assumptions about North American power are breaking apart. The real question now is whether the United States can adapt to this new environment, or whether Canada's pivot marks the beginning of a geopolitical shift that Washington never saw coming.
And that decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between Canada and the United States is over. And as a consequence of particularly that last point, many of our former strengths, based on our close ties to America, have become our vulnerability.
Canada has just delivered a message it can't walk back from, and Prime Minister Mark Carney chose to deliver it without hesitation. In one of the clearest statements from a Canadian leader in decades, Carney declares that the long era of deep economic integration with the United States is not easing, drifting, or gradually unwinding. It is over. He calls it nothing less than a rupture. For a country whose prosperity has been shaped by access to U.S. markets for half a century, the implications are massive, and the response Carney outlines marks the beginning of an entirely new economic chapter.
Carney makes this declaration while presenting his first full federal budget, positioning it as a response to a world undergoing rapid technological shifts and rising geopolitical friction. He warns that decades of growing economic ties with the United States have ended abruptly, and Canada must adapt.
At the center of his message is a stark figure. U.S. tariffs and U.S.-driven uncertainty are set to cost Canada 1.8% of GDP, roughly $50 billion, the equivalent of $1,300 for every Canadian. Carney drives the point home with a sentence that would have been unthinkable from earlier prime ministers. Nostalgia is not a strategy. The U.S. has changed, that's their right, but we must respond. His remarks mirror the reality reported by Reuters throughout 2025. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, has entrenched tariffs as the central pillar of U.S. economic policy. Tariffs between 10 and 100% remain in place, and Washington has repeatedly surprised allies by skipping summits, rewriting trade rules overnight, and tying industrial policy directly to domestic political goals. Even the APEC truce with China has left tariffs at historically high levels. In this environment, Carney argues, Canada can no longer assume stability from its closest partner. The economic model based on U.S. predictability is breaking down, and clinging to the past will only deepen the losses.
And this is happening fast. This is not a transition, it's a rupture. And it means that our economic strategy needs to change dramatically and rapidly.
Carney's use of the word rupture is deliberate. He is signaling that the change is structural and irreversible. U.S. protectionism is now bipartisan, not a quirk of Trump alone. And Washington's reshoring push is pulling investment away from Canada at a pace no government in Ottawa can afford to ignore. He warns that what once gave Canada an advantage, integrated supply chains, easy regulatory alignment, and stable market access, now exposes the country to sudden American shifts. When Washington moves abruptly, Canadian industries feel the impact within weeks, not years. The United States has also become harder to predict. The decision to skip the G20 summit, a sudden round of new tariffs or new subsidies tied to U.S. factory job creation can rewrite economic expectations overnight. For an open economy like Canada, unpredictability is as damaging as tariffs themselves. Carney is essentially telling Canadians this: the era of assuming the U.S. will behave like a stable economic anchor is gone.
Carney presents his budget not as a normal fiscal plan, but as a national correction, a blueprint for rebuilding strength at home and reducing exposure abroad. The plan revolves around three major ideas: building domestic resilience, boosting productivity, and diversifying trade. He frames these not as abstract goals, but as necessities for survival in a new global landscape. The push to build at home includes accelerating infrastructure and energy projects and strengthening Canada's manufacturing base. Carney wants the country to regain control over essential production and become less vulnerable to external shocks. This sits alongside his second push, lifting Canada's lagging productivity. Years of slow growth have left Canadian workers at a disadvantage, and Carney argues that shifting toward advanced manufacturing, AI integration, and higher efficiency construction is essential for long-term prosperity. The third idea, diversification, is the centerpiece of his rupture strategy. Carney wants Canada to deepen relationships across Asia and Europe rather than relying overwhelmingly on the United States. His government is expanding ties with South Korea and Japan, restarting momentum with ASEAN, carefully reopening lines of communication with China, and leaning into new opportunities with India and the EU. The message is clear: Canada's future markets will not be concentrated in one place. This part of the speech directly responds to one of the most sensitive questions in Canadian politics. Can Canada afford to reduce its dependence on the United States? For Carney, the answer is no longer optional. The dependence has already become a liability.
Carney's declaration has reshaped the country's internal political debate. Business leaders are split. Some welcome diversification, seeing Asia's demand as an opportunity. Others worry about losing frictionless access to the U.S. market. Carney counters by stressing the size and depth of Canada's domestic financial system, its pension funds, banks, and institutional investors, arguing that if government sets stable rules, investment at home can surge. The opposition insists that Carney's rhetoric risks antagonizing Washington and making Canada's situation worse, but supporters argue that the rupture is a fact, not a choice. Carney is simply acknowledging reality rather than sheltering Canadians from it. The political stakes are enormous. In redefining Canada's economic strategy, Carney is also redefining how Canadians think about their place in North America. For decades, the U.S. was the foundation of the country's prosperity. Carney is now positioning independence, not proximity, as the marker of success.
For ordinary Canadians, Carney's message is both a warning and a promise. The warning is that the immediate future will involve higher costs and unpredictable supply chains as U.S. tariffs ripple through the economy. The promise is that Canada can reshape itself into a more resilient, more diversified, and ultimately more independent economic power. Over the medium term, shifting away from a U.S.-centric model could bring new investment and new export markets. Partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and ASEAN offer growing opportunities, while a diplomatic reset with China, cautiously but deliberately, could reopen access to one of the world's largest consumer markets. Over the long term, Carney sees Canada positioning itself as a leader in critical minerals, clean energy, and next-generation technology. To him, this is not simply economic management, it is nation-building.
Carney's declaration marks a moment of national reorientation. He is telling Canadians that the economic world they grew up with is gone, and the country must build a new one fast. Whether his strategy becomes a success story or a difficult transition will depend on how quickly Canada adapts, and how convincingly it can build strength outside the shadow of U.S. unpredictability. But in Carney's view, the rupture has already happened. The only question now is how Canada chooses to move forward.
The federal government is hitting back at two big automakers. Ottawa calling it unacceptable that Stellantis and General Motors are both scaling back manufacturing in Canada, breaching its commitment. Ottawa is now trying to put pressure on them to back down by limiting the number of vehicles they can bring in from the U.S. tariff-free.
It started with a headline that sent shockwaves through North America's auto industry. Ottawa announced that it was cutting the number of American-made vehicles allowed into Canada without tariffs. Overnight, what once looked like a quiet trade exemption turned into a loud political statement. The decision came after two major U.S. automakers, Stellantis and General Motors, scaled back production in Canada. For years, both companies had enjoyed the privilege of importing cars from the United States tariff-free. That deal came with one condition: keep investing and building in Canada. When they failed to honor that promise, the Canadian government struck back. Ottawa's move isn't just about cars or trade figures, it's about drawing a line. In a region where the U.S. has dominated economic decisions for decades, Canada is finally saying, enough. What Trump once called an industrial revival for America has now triggered something far bigger, a political counterattack from the very ally he's been squeezing.
The details of Canada's decision reveal how carefully calculated it is. Starting this month, Stellantis will lose half of its duty-free import quota, while General Motors faces a 24% reduction. These exemptions were part of Canada's response to the 25% retaliatory tariff it imposed on U.S. vehicles after Trump's trade escalation. By scaling back those privileges, Ottawa isn't just reacting, it's redefining the rules of engagement. The government's message is simple. Companies that move production south of the border will pay more to sell in Canada. Officials say this is about fairness, not punishment. Canada invested over $105 million to modernize facilities in Ontario, including Brampton and Windsor, under the condition that automakers maintained their footprint. Instead, they shifted production to Illinois and halted electric van production in Ingersoll. That violated the agreement, and the government responded with precision. The brilliance of this move lies in its restraint. There are no shouting matches, no populist threats. Instead, Ottawa is fighting back with regulation, a trade weapon that's quiet, legal, and effective. It's not a tariff war. It's a policy chess match, and this time, Washington isn't the only one holding the board.
Behind this confrontation is the unmistakable shadow of Donald Trump's America First doctrine. His second-term agenda has pushed multinational companies to relocate manufacturing to the United States through a web of tariffs and incentives. On paper, it's a triumph. Jobs are returning to America, factories reopening, the industrial belt revived. But that same policy has set off a chain reaction north of the border. By forcing automakers to choose between American and Canadian production, Trump's strategy has cornered his closest trading partner. Canada, once pressured to comply, is now rewriting the rules. Instead of accepting Washington's dominance, Ottawa has used the moment to harden its own industrial identity. The government's new approach rewards loyalty and punishes flight, a model that mirrors Trump's tactics but serves Canadian interests. What was meant to make the U.S. stronger is now giving birth to a more assertive Canada. Trump's aggressive reshoring campaign didn't just change where cars are built, it changed how Canada sees itself in the global industrial race. The irony is striking. In trying to make America great again, Trump has awakened a neighbor that refuses to stay quiet or submissive. Canada has learned to fight back using the very instruments Trump relied on: policy, pressure, and pride.
Across Ontario, where factory closures have hit hardest, the mood has shifted from anger to determination. Unions and suppliers, usually divided by labor negotiations, now speak with one voice. They want accountability. They want production to stay in Canada. Public sentiment is equally firm. A nationwide poll released this month shows that 79% of Canadians worry about the future of the auto industry. 74% believe losing it would have a devastating impact on the national economy. Most strikingly, 2/3 of respondents, 67%, say they would boycott any company that moves its operations from Canada to the United States. For many Canadians, this isn't just about cars, it's about dignity. It's about whether their country will continue to build or merely extract and import. The government's decision to restrict duty-free access resonates deeply because it feels like a defense of national identity. Factories in Brampton and Ingersoll once symbolized the strength of Canada's manufacturing core. Now they stand as a reminder of what's at stake. And for the first time in years, workers, business owners, and policymakers are united around a single idea: Canada must control its own industrial future. That unity gives Ottawa leverage. It sends a clear signal to Trump's Washington. Political bullying may work elsewhere, but not here. Canada has found its footing and is willing to fight for every job, every investment, every plant that defines its industrial heart.
Ottawa's quota cuts are more than a technical policy change. They're a declaration of independence in a trade relationship long tilted toward the U.S. What began as a response to two automakers has evolved into a warning aimed straight at the White House. The message is unmistakable. If America wants to play hardball, Canada can too. Trump's trade strategy was designed to pull industry home, but it's now driving Canada to shield its economy with the same tools. Instead of folding under pressure, Ottawa has embraced its own version of industrial nationalism, disciplined, rules-based, and unapologetically firm. The impact of this decision will ripple far beyond the auto sector. It challenges the assumption that the U.S. can dictate the pace of North American production. It also marks the beginning of a new era where Canada uses trade policy not just for defense, but for power projection. As the next round of trade talks looms in Washington, the balance of leverage is changing. Canada's actions have shown that it's not the silent partner in North America anymore. It's a country ready to define its own destiny, even if that means confronting its largest trading ally.
Trump's industrial crusade promised to restore America's dominance. Instead, it has united Canadian workers, galvanized their government, and reshaped an industry once thought dependent on U.S. goodwill. The tables have turned. Ottawa is no longer asking for leniency. It's setting the terms. And in doing so, it's turned Trump's greatest economic weapon into a mirror, one that reflects his own policy back at him. In the end, what began as a trade pressure campaign may go down as the moment Canada found its industrial voice. Trump wanted to make America stronger again. What he didn't expect was to make Canada stronger too.
So U.S. President Donald Trump has moved to put taxes of 25% on heavy truck imports.
Trump announced the change will take effect on October 1st, writing on Truth Social last night that the large-scale flooding of the products into the U.S. by other countries is unfair to local manufacturers.
On the evening of September 30th, President Donald Trump confirmed that a new round of import tariffs will take effect on October 1st. Among them is a 25% duty on heavy-duty trucks entering the United States. The White House frames the decision as a matter of fairness and even national security, pointing to what it calls a flood of imported vehicles. But this is not just a technical adjustment. It is a major hit to one of the most critical arteries of the American economy, the trucking industry. Heavy trucks are not luxury items. They are the backbone of how food, building materials, and manufactured goods move across the country. By raising their price, the government is not only challenging foreign competitors, it is raising the stakes for every American business that depends on freight. To understand the weight of this decision, consider the numbers. Industry data show that a new Class 8 truck, the standard for long-haul transport, sells for about $170,000. Add a 25% tariff to imported models, plus the 12% federal excise tax already in place, and the final price for many fleets will climb well above $220,000 per vehicle. That gap of $50,000 or more is not small change for operators. For large carriers, it means higher capital costs. For small and medium-sized fleets, it means delaying purchases and stretching old equipment further. Trucks are typically run 100 to 120,000 miles each year in their first phase of use, then rotated into lighter service after 5 or 6 years. When replacement is delayed, maintenance costs rise, safety margins narrow, and efficiency falls. Some companies like PACCAR, which makes Kenworth and Peterbilt trucks, may see a relative advantage. Analysts note that earlier tariffs on steel and aluminum pushed up their costs by 10 to 15% compared to rivals building vehicles in Mexico and shipping them into the United States without penalty. A tariff on finished trucks does reduce that gap. Yet what is a relief for one manufacturer becomes a burden spread across the wider economy. Higher acquisition costs for equipment ripple through freight rates, logistics expenses, and ultimately the prices consumers pay. Just across the border, the picture looks different. Canada is a significant exporter of medium and heavy trucks into the American market, often through assembly plants that meet USMCA rules of origin. In early September, Ottawa lifted most of its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, keeping only those tied to steel, aluminum, and autos. By pulling back on broader surtaxes, Canada preserved leverage and signaled readiness to negotiate. For Canadian producers, this flexibility matters. If their vehicles qualify under USMCA, they may avoid or limit the impact of Trump's new tariff. That opens a channel for Canada to present itself as a stable and compliant partner at the very moment American buyers face higher costs at home. The intended message of this policy is protection. The real effect may be strain. Trucking is the pulse of American commerce. Raising the price of the vehicles that keep it moving means higher costs for retailers, construction firms, and farmers, long before it means new jobs in factories. Canada, by contrast, has positioned itself to weather the shock, reduce trade friction, and keep its exports flowing. The outcome is an inversion of Trump's promise. Instead of shielding American business, the tariff risks slowing it down, while giving Canada an unexpected opening in the continental supply chain. This is why many observers call it another example of a policy designed to protect, but destined to backfire.
Looking around the world now, you've got China sort of playing by its own playbook economically. You have the U.S. playing by its own playbook, ignoring various agreements, including at times USMCA. What does that mean for the rules-based system for a middle power like Canada?
At the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a message that left many in Washington unsettled.
And nobody's perfect in this. We have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And we're re-engaging with China and other major economies in terms of developing the rules bilaterally with them.
He announced that Canada would re-engage with China, seeking to establish a new framework for bilateral rules. This declaration landed just as the United States, under President Trump, has extended its reciprocal tariff regime to every major trading partner, including Canada. The tariffs were meant to force others into accepting America's terms. Yet Carney signaled that Canada was ready to chart its own path. Instead of bowing to pressure, Ottawa is turning outward, searching for new alliances and new leverage. The story begins with a clash of visions. Trump builds walls of tariffs. Carney opens doors to alternative partners. That contrast sets the stage for what comes next.
Carney made clear that both Washington and Beijing are playing by their own rulebooks. For Canada, that reality means waiting for others to return to multilateral discipline is no longer an option. Ottawa will now attempt to develop direct rules with China, recognizing the risks but also the opportunities of engaging the world's second-largest economy. Sensitive areas such as national security and data privacy will remain closed. Yet Canada intends to carve out a controlled space for trade and cooperation. This is not surrender but calculation. With Trump escalating confrontation and tariffs disrupting steel, autos, and farm products, Carney has decided that Canada must place a chip on every table. The re-engagement with China is meant to give Ottawa more balance and more say, even if it means moving in a direction opposite to Washington. This step is designed to give Canada breathing room at a time when U.S. trade actions are tightening around all partners. Carney also reminded his audience that Canada already holds positions in two of the world's largest rules-based systems, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as CPTPP, and the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. These agreements include standards for labor and sustainability, the kind of provisions that are recognizable and enforceable. By being part of both, Ottawa can serve as a bridge between Europe and Asia. The United States, by contrast, has stepped away. Trump pulled America out of the original TPP and has repeatedly ignored commitments under USMCA. Carney's point was not hidden. Canada is investing in systems where rules matter, while Washington sidelines itself. As those networks expand, America risks becoming the bystander. Ottawa is signaling that its future will not be locked inside Trump's tariff cage. Instead, Canada is building the kind of international bridges that leave Washington outside the room when new rules are written. Carney did not deny Canada's vulnerability. Nearly 80% of Canadian trade still flows south into the United States. But he emphasized the importance of what he called the growth at the margin. New trade with Europe, with CPTPP countries, and with China can shift the balance over time. Even small increases in those directions can change the outlook for industries battered by tariffs. Trump's reciprocal tariffs, meant to squeeze, are creating the incentive for Canada to move elsewhere. The backfire is clear. Instead of reinforcing dependence, the policy has accelerated diversification. Canada is showing that it can step out of America's shadow and place itself in the center of a different global map. The contrast could not be sharper. Trump designed his tariff regime to keep Canada in line, but Carney's new approach flips that logic. By re-engaging with China and doubling down on Europe and Asia, Ottawa is no longer asking Washington for permission. Canada is signaling that it has options and that the United States is not the only game in town. This is the image that left Trump stunned, watching as his neighbor quietly walked out of the cage he built. That is why Carney's words in New York carried such weight. Trump sought to lock Canada in. Ottawa has walked out, leaving the U.S. president stunned as his northern neighbor rewrites the script of survival and influence.